Karen and David Swift's marriage ended sometime around 3:30 a.m. on October 30th, 2011. Sadly, it didn't end the way Karen had envisioned it might when she filed for divorce earlier that month from David. But for all intents and purposes, their marriage had been over for a long time. You heard the troubles their relationship had, from David's affair that bore a son, to a divorce, to Karen's affair that caused David to believe that a quick, hasty move to Tennessee would change things, so abrupt that he left his oldest son, Preston, in Arkansas, so abrupt that Karen didn't even see the house that they moved to in Tennessee before they moved into it. But the move only made Karen more independent from David. Her desire to be free from him only grew in Dyersburg. Karen made friends in Dyersburg. David did not. Karen was liked by many people she met in Dyersburg, and you've heard from several of them during the course of the trial. David struggled to fit in, and David's jealousy drove them further apart. His behavior was so bizarre that he was barred from Karen's friends' homes. David's controlling and stalking behavior ultimately led to Karen borrowing money from her friends and filing for divorce. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the spark that lit the powder keg. For a man who thrived on control, Karen was about to strip that away from him. They were struggling financially as a family. David couldn't afford to maintain the lifestyle he was accustomed to and pay child support and alimony. He wouldn't see his girls as nearly often as he had before. And while those things were important to him, losing control of Karen was the most important to him. Recall the testimony of his obsessive behavior when it came to Karen. Remember the testimony of him hiding in her Murano at Walmart and then confronting Kathy Bona when they returned. Remember how he stalked Amanda MacArthur and Karen when they were just going to Big Lots. Remember how he stalked her at Applebee's while she was just having dinner with Jeannie Garion. Remember how he surprised Janie Helm in her own backyard while he was trying to spy on Karen at the Bonas. And those are just the times we know of. Those are just the times he got caught. But that's the backstory. Let's get down to the murder of Karen Swift. I submit David's preparation to kill Karen started in earnest on August 25th when he twisted his knee, his previously injured knee, at work in Tanaris. He was just standing there and he flopped into the arms of a coworker. That was his first manifestation of his intent to kill Karen. He would very publicly hobble around on crutches and pretend to be injured so people would think that there was no way that he could kill his wife. But what do we know about his claim of being disabled? Well, let's first go to the 29th. You recall Mr. Terry Harris talking about how David could drag 60-pound hay bales with no trouble. Carrie Smith, his physical therapist, told you there's a big difference in being able to carry something and being able to drag it. You also heard Carrie Smith tell you that he began a physical therapy regimen with David on November 16th, just weeks after Karen's murder. Mr. Smith knew better than anyone of David's physical capabilities at the time of the murder, and he stated without reservation that in his professional opinion, David was capable of dragging Karen's lifeless body out of the house, into a vehicle, and down into the kudzu at Bledsoe Cemetery. Let's continue with the morning of the 29th. Remember, David goes to the skating rink and has that bizarre conversation with a woman he didn't even know. Later that day, David takes Keeley to the mall and encounters Janie Helm again. He tells her this was the same Janie Helm who told him to stay out of her backyard, the same Janie Helm who witnessed him driving up and down the road in front of the Bonas house whenever she would be visiting them. David told Janie about Karen's rebuff of his romantic invitation to a reconciliation dinner that night. He even asked if he could go back in her yard that night and spy on Karen again. As one might imagine, she again told him no. That dinner invitation rebuff was also recounted to you by Jason Creasy, Miss Swift's attorney. I submit that rejection that night was the straw that broke the camel's back, ladies and gentlemen. David goes home from the mall and he stews. He's sitting there with Keeley. Rejection eats at him while Karen is out partying with the Bonas and the Lees. And it finally sinks into him that night. Karen is really leaving him, and this time it's forever. After the party, the Bonas go with Karen and they get some fries and they head back to her house. Karen planned to spend the night with the Bonas that night, but you could tell by the text that I provided to you that David sent Karen that he didn't know that. He texted her around 10. When were you coming home? Go in the side door. The garage door's closed. Keely's in bed with me. Karen and the Bonas hadn't been at the Bonas long when Ashley, who had been at a sleepover, texted Karen. She wanted Karen to pick her up and come home. And of course, that's what Karen immediately did. Now, David's versions of events, what happened that night, varied. We know it was 2:08 a.m. because that's when Karen's iPhone connected to the network extender at the Swift home. But David's story generally was that he talked to Karen and Ashley briefly, and then he went back to bed and slept until 10 o'clock the next morning when he discovered that Karen and her Murano were missing. But what was he really doing while he claimed to be asleep? We know from Special Agent Wade that he was awake because he was active on his computer from around 2:45 to 3:30. And what's he doing on his computer during that time? Well, we know he's accessing photos of Karen's tattoo. And I submit he's also accessing a device of Karen's, because what are the chances David's going to have 25 plus pictures of Karen's landscaping jobs on his phone? I submit David was sitting up in his room getting angrier and angrier at the woman who rejected him. He's sitting in his room until his anger boils over and he decides to end his humiliation and end his marriage, but again, not in the way Karen had envisioned. I have to be candid. It is impossible to tell you the exact manner or mechanism of Karen's death. You heard Dr. Ross, the medical examiner, state to many questions the body was simply too decomposed to tell. I submit to you, though, that given the physical evidence that we have, it is likely that David strangled Karen, dragged her body to the garage, and ended her life, if she wasn't already dead, with a blow to the head. However, to prove David killed Karen, the state is not required to prove the exact means of Karen's death beyond a reasonable doubt. What we are required to prove is who killed Karen beyond a reasonable doubt. Who, not how, is the decision you will have to make here. Now go back to David is up in his room. He's formulating his plan. He knows Ashley's a problem for his plans for Karen because she's in bed with Karen. He can't risk waking Ashley. So he goes down, he picks her up, and puts her in Keely's room next door. And then he goes back to Karen. He had to get control of her somehow. I submit that he strangled her because her nails were not broken. There was no fingernail no DNA, under her fingernails. Those are classic signs of a victim that didn't struggle. What is important that Karen, he then drags her to the garage. With Karen's head lying on the concrete floor, he administers a powerful blow to her head. The exact object cannot be known, according to the medical examiner, Dr. Ross. And I submit, ultimately, it's unimportant for our consideration here today. What is important is that she did receive a blow so powerful that it fractured the right side of her skull into pieces, sending chips of bone into her brain. The left side of her brain experienced less severe fracturing, consistent with being held against a solid object, such as a garage floor. The opposing forces that were administered to her head caused the natural sutures in her head that were hardened when she was a child to come apart. Whatever state she was in entering the garage, that blow to the head ended her life. Dr. Ross testified that this wound could have been a closed head wound, which means no blood, or maybe very little blood. I submit there might have been some blood because all the bleach bottles in the backyard. Late October is not the time to clean a pool, and I submit from the photo of the pool and evidence behind the bleach bottles, that pool hadn't been attended to for quite some time. Now Karen is dead, and David is faced with a dilemma, what to do with her body. First, he has to worry about Ashley waking up. Remember, Keely's still upstairs in his bed. Either one wakes up alone and he's caught. So he moves Keely from his bed to downstairs with Ashley, where he had moved her previously. That way, if either girl wakes up, they will have the other one and hopefully go back to sleep. David loads Karen's body into either her Murano or his Volvo, drives the 6 minutes to the cross, and drags her into a depression. Now, he's in a hurry, so he doesn't have a lot of time to cover her body up, so he drags her into a little dip, and he hopes that that is sufficient enough for her not to be seen by anybody who is driving or walking by. And it worked. She wasn't found for 40 days. The distance that he had to drag her from that road, and you see it in the picture there, it's not a formal paved road, but it's a path that's obviously traveled a lot by cars, was only about 20 feet, the testimony showed. I submit that the picture of Karen's body in her underpants completely support that she was dragged. Normally, when underpants are worn, they are up around the hips. Karen's was down. You could imagine that somebody dragging a body, the underpants would naturally scrape across the earth and have them pulled down somewhat. I submit that if you look at that gruesome photo of the body that's submitted into evidence, you will see that that is what happened to her underpants. Now that his task is accomplished, David heads back. He has more work to do. The cover-up. He's got to make it look like she just took off in the middle of the night. So he gets an idea. I'll make it look like she had a flat. Drive her car down the road and leave it like she abandoned it after getting a flat tire. So he takes an item that's in every garage in America almost, a screw and a screwdriver, and he inserts the screw into her tire. But what he didn't count on was that the screw wouldn't have caused the tire to go flat immediately. So he's forced to deflate it. And he does that by manually depressing the stem. He goes back to the house and collects Karen's iPhone. The phone goes off the network extender at 4:38, and down the road he goes. This is consistent with what Miss Mary McWhorters told you she heard and when she heard it. The defense will have you believe that her phone did not go off the network extender until 5:09. Their expert testified, don't believe Verizon and their records, believe me. What makes his testimony so unbelievable is he'd have you believe that at 5:09, she left the house and immediately turned off her phone. But what's interesting is that he really didn't have an answer for, at 5:09, that exact moment she left the house, her iPhone quit accepting data forever. Think about it. How likely is it that you're leaving your house to meet someone, and the second you walk out of your door, you turn your phone off? It just doesn't follow. But let's go back to what really happened. There are two flaws in David's plan he didn't count on. First, driving a car on a flat tire is noisy. So much so that he woke his neighbor, Mary McWhorters. Second, it most likely didn't occur to him before he started out on his journey that he couldn't just drive her car to some far-off place. He'd have to walk back. And walking back on the side of the road at that time of night, when only people who were walking that's not of their own choosing would be on the road. He would draw attention if somebody drove down the road and saw him walking. So he leaves the car at the first intersection, Harness and Millsfield. Mr. Bolden and the defense's tire experts testified that the front tire that was flat showed extensive run-flat damage, consistent with being driven on while flat for a good distance. At the highway, David makes another mistake. David's tall. Karen was short. He forgot to move the seat back forward when he got out. You heard Deputy Alexander testify that he's 6'2", and when he got in the car, he didn't have to move the seat back. It's an understandable mistake. David had a lot on his mind at that time. So he gets out of the car and begins the short walk home, 5 minutes at a leisurely pace. Then he remembers he still has Karen's phone. He can't take it back in the house because the network extender will register that. So he stomps it into what you see in the pictures and tosses it in the brush off the abandoned driveway on Harness, which is on his way back home. I submit to you that the iPhone is critical in this case because logic will tell you that the person that smashed Karen's iPhone also smashed Karen. Agent Rexon testified that before it was destroyed, the iPhone was somewhere on the wide arc she just showed you in the pictures. She also told you the tower connections that she read in the RTT reports showed that the phone was most likely in that bottom arc away from the Mississippi River and the bottom part of the arc, which is where Karen's body was disposed of, where the Swift home was, where the phones were discovered, and where the car was abandoned. So common sense and simple math tell us that it was on the far right side of the arc, because Marty Lamb and Jimmy Martin both testified that they saw Karen's vehicle at 5:15, just 6 minutes after the iPhone was destroyed. So when was Karen's iPhone smashed and tossed in the weeds? Again, that's something I can't give you an exact answer to. The phone was found, we know the phone had its last contact with Verizon at 5:09. It was found by Trooper Page 145 feet off Harness Road in the woods. That driveway that led into that was only 578 feet from the Swift home, and directly on the path David would have taken going home. And because it was destroyed, that iPhone no longer connected to the network extender or to Verizon's towers. The twist about Karen's phones is this. Remember, the iPhone was found right beside the Voyager phone. What was the last activity of the Voyager phone? Agent Wade testified to you that at 9:55 that morning, it called voicemail. That's 5 hours after almost 5 hours after Karen's iPhone was destroyed. Agent Wade told you that call does not appear on the Voyager's Verizon records. And Agent Rexing and Agent Wade both told you that the reason why a phone call would appear in an extraction but not on the Verizon records is that call was being routed through another type of network, such as a network extender. Ladies and gentlemen, that Voyager phone called voicemail at 9:55 on October 30th from the Swift home. The compelling fact of this is that the phones were found together. The person who dialed voicemail at 9:55 in the Swift home was the same person who destroyed Karen's iPhone. How else could they get in the woods together? Whoever discarded the Voyager phone had to have known where that iPhone was. But when did he do it? Again, we cannot know. He might have tossed the iPhone on the way back from the Murano. Makes sense that Karen would try to hide the phone that she was concealing from David somewhere in her room, in a drawer under her mattress. David had plenty of time to get back and search her room and find it before the girls got up around 10. You saw the pictures of her room. It was ransacked. Not like David was hesitant at all to snoop in Karen's room. Remember the story he so unnecessarily happily relayed to both sets of detectives who interviewed him about the glass object he found in her coat pocket? And if there's any question in your mind about David possessing that Voyager phone, remember David telling officers in that first interview, almost right off the bat, that he had confronted Jamie Gurian the night before, which was October 30th, the day Karen went missing, that he had confronted Jamie because he had discovered Jamie and Karen had been talking. Agent Wade told you the only calls between Jamie and Karen were on that Voyager phone, the phone David professed not to know she had. So David calls Jamie Gurian on the night she went missing and inquires to him about calls made on a phone he claims to not know of. David pretends to sleep, or he does whatever he's doing. We know there was some period of computer activity again that morning, and the girls wake around 10. He acts surprised when they tell him their mom isn't home. He calls Karen's phone, sends a few texts, pretending not to know where she is. He keeps this up until Jenny Lamb tells him Karen's car's on the highway around 2 that afternoon. By this time, her friends, the Bonas, are getting a little freaked out. They can't get a hold of Karen. After Kathy talks to David, Bill Bona reports her as a missing person to the Dyer County Sheriff's Office. Brandon Alexander, who's now with the Dyersburg Police, is first to respond. He finds the vehicle secure, doors locked, windows up. David brings a spare key to the scene, and Alexander checks the vehicle for signs of foul play. This is when he sits in the Murano's driver's seat without having to move it. Nothing seems amiss, so Alexander, once Sergeant Walker gets on scene, he goes off to take other calls. Sergeant Walker calls his higher-ups, such as Chief Investigator McCright, and asks permission to have the car towed at that point. He knows that it's important to preserve any evidence that might be found in the vehicle. Sergeant Walker asks David if he can do a walkthrough at the house and see if there are signs of an obvious struggle. Seeing none, he leaves. He comes back later with Deputy Petrie, and they are talking to David out in the front yard. Their testimony was that David was more than excited to share his experience as a reserve deputy sheriff in Arkansas, but when they asked him direct questions about Karen, he lowered his head and searched for answers. The next morning, it's October 31st, it's Monday morning. Chief Investigator McCright assembles other investigators from the Sheriff's Office along with TBI agent Nathan Bishop to formulate a plan to search for Karen. Exigent circumstance requests are sent to Verizon and search parties are planned. But first, Chief Investigator McCright wants more experienced deputies or more experienced investigators to interview David to dig a little deeper. So David comes to the office, and right off the bat, he starts telling investigators that just yesterday he discovered that Karen had another phone that the bonus gave her. He tells them about confronting Jamie Gurian the previous evening. Now, I've already reminded you that Karen's Verizon phones, the phone that David, remember, was showing Deputy Alexander. He brought Deputy Alexander into Karen's room, and he brought up her Verizon account and was showing him her records. There were no calls to Jamie Gurian on that phone. The only way David could have known that she and Jamie Gurian had talked was if he had possession of that Voyager phone and was scrolling through the call log. Now, Jamie testified that he didn't remember the calls, but the records are the records. And it's not that just that David lied about the Voyager phone. It's why he lied, because he had to. When he was being interviewed by those investigators, he knew that Voyager phone was lying in the weeds right beside that iPhone in the woods. It'd be pretty hard to explain how he knew the contents of a phone that he was claiming he didn't know existed. He goes on to tell the investigators of his version of talking to Janie Helm at the mall that night. He tells the investigators, she told him, you got to come in my backyard to see what's really going on. You heard Janie Helm testify. Do you think she really invited David into her backyard? Pretty much the rest of the interviews are David nonstop Karen bashing, not so subtly telling the investigators Karen was a drunk, a serial adulterer. The implication being with somebody who's that wild and careless, anything could have happened to her. David's self-serving interviews aside, let's focus on the night in question. Because for someone other than David Swift to have killed Karen, there are several things you must believe have occurred. First, Karen must have had plans to meet someone that night. No one just leaves the house at 4:30 on a Sunday morning to aimlessly drive around. You heard Agent Wade. Her last text from a romantic interest ended with, "Call me sometime. I'd love to take you to dinner." Second, Karen would have had to have moved both Ashley and Keeley to the other bedroom. Does that make sense? Remember, David texted Karen and said, Keeley's in bed with me. She was 5. This was the middle of the night. Karen would have never gone into David's bedroom to move Keeley. It just doesn't make sense. She was trying to sneak out, as the defense claims. Why would she risk waking not one, but 2 sleeping children and alerting David by going into his bedroom? It simply doesn't make sense, ladies and gentlemen. Think about the timing of it as well. What had Karen done on the day of the 29th? She spent her day cleaning a filthy Habitat for Humanity home in Trimble. She had gone to a party where she had some drinks. Kathy Bona said she was drinking margaritas. She picks up Ashley and arrives home. We can surmise by the toxicology report and the bottle of PM cold medicine in a half-empty water bottle by her bed, she took a Benadryl and went to sleep. Benadryl on top of alcohol, what did Dr. Ross say about that? Greatly enhanced sedative effects. Karen, after all of that, the defense will have you believe, gets up to meet someone on 2.5 hours of sleep. Remember the last text from the Voyager phone that she received. Call me sometime. I'd love to take you out to dinner. That's hardly, hey, let's meet at 5 o'clock in the morning. Mary Claire Hopper testified that Karen was expected to be cleaning the Trimble house again that Sunday. Karen needed that money. She would have never missed an opportunity to earn cash to get away from David. Next, let's talk about the tire in depth. The defense will have you believe that the Murano ran over the screw heading to Millsfield Highway. Let's break down the opinions of the experts. First, they both agree there was no manufacturing or design defects in the tire. Second, they both agree the tire was severely damaged from operating while flat. Third, they partially agree with the conclusion of their expert partially agrees with Mr. Bolden's conclusion that the loss of air was from the screw. Mr. Darr said it could have come from the valve stem. Mr. Bolden's response to that, when I asked him, he said, "Of course it could have come from the valve stem. I was only hired to examine damage to the tire." Lastly, and most important, the defense's expert asserts the screw could have been inserted perpendicularly through natural acts of driving down the road. First thing to note about this opinion, and it's a big note, they claimed the tire was not available for inspection, so they could only examine photographs they described in their report as having poor resolution. Chief McCright testified, and it was unrebutted by the defense, that no one ever asked to examine that tire. So Quality Forensic Engineering made a decision to offer you a report on a tire they never physically inspected and claimed it was because it was not available. That being said, let's turn our attention to the conclusions they reached. They stated they had tested thousands of tires over the years, and many, I quote, many screws and nails had been seen to enter the tested tire perpendicularly. They continued to say it was, and again I quote, unlikely that they were all manually inserted, and it is plausible a screw could be inserted perpendicularly through normal driving. That's essentially saying anything is possible. I asked Mr. Darr if he had any diagrams or illustrations that could explain to us mathematically how that could occur, and he did not. Mr. Bolden's next conclusion about that entering perpendicular is also compelling, because he told you that he knew that it was manually inserted because the head of the screw was below the tire tread. Quality asserts, oh, hold on. The tire could have, after having driven over that screw perpendicularly, as Mr. Bolden said, a stars aligning moment, that it also could have driven over a pebble of precise size. Can't be too big or it'll hit the treads. It has to be the precise size and has to hit that screw head exactly right to drive it up underneath the treads. That's the second star aligning event that the defense says happened in a quarter mile. Next, Quality took issue with Mr. Bolden's assertion that because he did not see localized tearing on the inside tire liner, that supported his conclusion that it was inserted manually. The defense expert, Mr. Darr, instead of testing a similar inflated tire, he takes a similar tire, doesn't inflate it, sticks wooden blocks in it, and then he hammers screws into the tire and puts his drill into the tire and claims that this was a comparable examination. Have you ever heard the term comparing apples to oranges? I submit Quality's Engineering's report is just that. But let's continue with the defense's theory of Karen's death. So she snuck out. Her car runs over a screw, then runs over a rock, which wedges the screw deeper in the tire. It deflates. She continues to drive, causing the run flat damage. Now she's on Millsfield Highway. We know she left the house at 4:38. That is consistent with what Mary McWhorter's heard going down the road at that time. She stops at the intersection. What do we know about the Murano? You saw the pictures of the back. The jack had not been attempted to be accessed. We know from her phone records, both Verizon and the iPhone and the Voyager records, she didn't phone a friend, she didn't call AAA. So what's the only other option she could have been, the only option she was faced with? Her only alternative was to walk home. You heard one of her friends testify Karen was in such good shape she could have made a quarter-mile walk in 3 minutes. So she starts walking back. And her phone, we know, stopped connecting towers at 5:09 when it was presumably destroyed. The defense will have you believe that John Hogshooter, just like Mary McQuarters, was woken up by Karen's flat tire going down the road. And in those few minutes after he was woken up, that he walked or drove down to where Karen was at Millsfield Highway and instantly formed the intent to abduct and kill her. A woman he didn't even know. John Hogshooter, who'd spent the entire weekend at church-related events, really had murder in his heart. That's what the defense will have you believe. And think about this. How would John Hogshooter would have been able to creep up on Karen while she was walking home and kill her? Where would he have taken her? His wife was home. There were no defensive wounds. Remember, her fingernails were intact. There was no DNA under her fingernails. Karen was described as a feisty woman. She'd have fought John Hogshooter if he tried to grab her on that road. The defense will have you believe that Hogshooter was able to get her off the road before 5:15 when Marty Lamb and Jimmy Martin saw her vehicle. Ladies and gentlemen, your charge is one of reasonable doubt. I submit the defense's John Hogshooter theory is anything but reasonable. I submit that the state has shown you reasonable doubt, or showed beyond a reasonable doubt, that only one person on the planet had the motive, the means, and most importantly, the opportunity to kill Karen Swift. I submit that David's self-reported knee injury and hobbling around on crutches in a brace was proof that he was formulating a plan to kill Karen and used his supposed disability as a defense. It's hard to remember you're supposed to be hurt when you're really not. From hay bales to jumping off on a four-wheeler, you've heard several witnesses testify that his claim of injury was at best exaggerated. Kerry Smith is a man who testified to you, and as a physical therapist, his whole professional life was devoted to testing people's and their physical capabilities due to injuries and rehabbing those injuries. Mr. Smith told you without hesitation that David Swift on October 30th was capable of dragging Karen's 125-pound lifeless body. This case is about one thing: identity. Who killed Karen Swift? Given all that you heard, I'm confident you will come to the conclusion there's only one person in the planet that could have killed Karen Swift, and it was David. David was content with the status quo at 65 Willie Johnson Road. He was happy. He was fine with being in a marriage that was a marriage in name only. Karen was not, and David killed her for it.
Mr. Taylor? Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning. I believe the judge is going to enforce these time standards, so let me get to the